It's time
for 15 minutes of non-stop MMA, tackling the biggest news in the sport. Head into the chat and let us know how you feel. Live from Fredericton, New Brunswick, Canada, here's your host, Craig Allen.
All right, and welcome to today's episode of Fight Night Picks Kicks. I mean, listen, this should be a great episode. I'm really looking forward to it. We have plenty of different subjects to cover. And we might as well get straight into it. So, like I said from the outset, Fight Night Picks Kicks. Maybe this is the first time you're tuning in. This is the first episode that you are watching. So what we're going to do in these episodes, it's a 15-minute quick hitter. We're going to go through 5 subjects. I've got Fedor versus Lesnar, McGregor versus Gaethje, a lot of elements heating up there. UFC Posters, PFL Championships, and your Fight Night Picks. So with your Fight Night Picks, I want to hear from you. We're live on YouTube, Periscope. You can find us over on Twitter as well with that Periscope connection. Head into the chat. Let me know what you're thinking. I can either save them for later, get into them now. But like you can see, our first thing today is going to be Fedor versus Lesnar. And it came out this week. It was in a UFC article, catching up with Dana White. The question was, we all have our fingers crossed that 5th time's a charm for Khabib Nurmagomedov versus Tony Ferguson, UFC 249. Besides that bout, what's a fight you'd still wish you could have made that didn't come together? And Dana White's response was, and I quote, "The only fight I wanted to make that was never made was Brock Lesnar versus Fedor Emelianenko. We were going to do it at Texas Stadium. Couldn't get the deal done with Fedor, so it never happened," which is very interesting that Dana White went that route and said that, because if you look at Fedor in his time with Strikeforce, it was a quick win. He ended up going on a losing streak. His only losing streak of his career, lost 3 straight. So it would have been interesting to see how a fight like that could have or would have came together. I mean, we're talking Fedor Emelianenko, the greatest of all time, versus Brock Lesnar, a guy who's had, 9 professional MMA fights. He's 5-3 with 1 no contest being the one against Mark Hunt at UFC 200. So it really would have been interesting to see how that would have played out, a Fedor versus Lesnar fight. I mean, if it was going to happen, he wanted to have it in Texas, one of your bigger MMA type of venues that you could have had at the time. And I mean, you look back at it now, let's talk like UFC 129 in Toronto. You had almost 56,000 people there. UFC recently, when you had Kelvin Gastelum, when you had Israel Adesanya taking on Robert Whittaker at Marvel Stadium, you had a huge crowd there. KSW's had big crowds. UFC's had big crowds in the past. It would have been great if we could have seen something like that. I mean, you talk about Texas in hockey with the Winter Classic, with the Dallas Stars and the Nashville Predators. They had 83,000 people at the Cotton Bowl this week to watch professional hockey. And with UFC growing at such a rapid rate, I wouldn't be surprised if they could hold an event like that. So when we're talking back and we're looking back, we're talking Fedor and Brock Lesnar. Man, wouldn't it have been something if we got that when both of those guys were still relatively in their primes, injury-free, they hadn't fallen off yet? That would have been great. Fedor versus Lesnar. Our next one, McGregor versus Gaethje. And like I said, if you want to tune in and have your say, do so in the chat. We're talking McGregor and Gaethje, and the interesting thing here is Conor McGregor had that interview that came out this week where you saw him talking with the Mac Life, and one of the things that he said was, and I will quote, "Conor McGregor or Justin Gaethje. He's on the list. Maybe I'll face him next. He has it coming to him. I mean, I laugh now at how Justin's behaving. He's a funny guy. He's been taking it to heart. You know the feeling when you do. So maybe I'll get through Donald. I'll have a quick turnaround against Justin. Maybe that's what will happen. So no doubt Justin's on my list," which is interesting to see that Conor McGregor is talking about Justin Gaethje so much, because usually what happens is he'll talk and then it happens, or he'll talk and there's a break and then it happens. So it'll be interesting to see how McGregor makes out against a guy in Donald Cerrone. I mean, we talked about it so much because there hasn't really been MMA lately. And next weekend, you got another weekend off, and then the big event with UFC 246. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. It'll be really interesting to get the post-fight interview. Whether it's a win or a loss, I'd like to see what's going on in the mind of Conor McGregor. You hear from Owen Roddy, John Kavanagh, Conor himself that training camp's going great, best we've ever seen him. He dictates the schedule. And we're really looking forward to what can happen or what's going to happen coming up later on at the pay-per-view in the main event against Cerrone. Of course, you've heard different things from Cerrone, from his camp, but it'll be interesting to see, A, what we get from Conor McGregor, and B, if he does get a win, who's he going to call out if he calls anybody out? So that's kind of going to be the interesting thing there. And I mean, if you look at Justin Gaethje, there were rumors and allegations that he was turning down fights. Tony Ferguson was one of the names that came up. Dan Hooker in his main event slot in Auckland, he's going to be taking on Paul Felder, but that was one of those names that was thrown around there. And if you look at Justin Gaethje, since he's come over to the UFC, win against Michael Johnson, fight of the year, fights Eddie Alvarez, loses to Dustin Poirier, absolutely demolishes James Vick, Edson Barboza, and Donald Cerrone in that order. And man, I mean, one of the highest flyers out there at 155 is Gaethje. And it's such a dynamic division. Like I mentioned, you had Hooker and Felder. That's a really big fight. You've got Ferguson and Khabib coming up early on this year in the spring. I mean, there's so many moving pieces. It'll be interesting to see what a win for McGregor truly means. And if he does win, does he fight at 55 next for the belt? Does he move up and fight Jorge Masvidal for the BMF title? Because I know he's mentioned that in the past. So it'll be interesting to see what happens there. And if we head into the chat just quickly, Oliver Sell says, Henry Cejudo's losing a lot of fans by the way he's responding to the Aljamain Yang callouts by saying to them he's not interested in fighting them, and should the UFC consider stripping him? I don't think they should consider stripping him. That's a really good question. And we've talked about Henry quite a bit in the live shows. They stripped him at 125. He'd been off for a really long time. Again, there's some movers and shakers at 25. And I think if you look at it, Figueiredo and Benavidez, they're due for a shot like that when they're going away with the belt. At 35, it's funny because Jan and Sterling are the two guys that I'm pretty high on as far as, being deserving of a title shot. So it'll be interesting to see what they do. I don't think they strip him of the belt. Of course, everything hinges on his return from injury. Same thing for Sterling, too. And, you can't strip him of two belts, I don't think. So it's all going to hinge on, the recovery process. He comes up in our fourth topic here. But you've seen him out at some extracurricular events, promoting himself. And he's just got to get the conversation going. So I think it's more of a marketing thing than anything. I know he also talked about the fact that he'd like to take on Jose Aldo. He said Jose Aldo's next, bend the knee on Twitter, which I think is crazy. But I'm one of those people that a win and a loss for a title, it's black and white to me. If you lose, you probably shouldn't get a title shot. The person who won, unless, they got hurt. I know a lot of people don't want to see Marlon Moraes take on Cejudo once again so soon. But, I mean, he beat Jose Aldo, and a lot of people are calling for Aldo to get a title shot. So I'll be interested to see what happens there. But it's a great question. And like I said, if you want to head into the chat, whether it's Periscope, Twitter, or over on YouTube, please do so. You're driving the show. You're in the driver's seat. I'm just going along for the ride, and I have my topics here, and we'll see where we end up. So McGregor versus Gaethje, interesting stuff there, I think, and can't wait to see what happens next there. All right. This is one of those curveball type of questions. One of those things that I threw it out there over on Twitter before I went live. I recorded a video and I wanted to get a bit of a reaction. So, UFC posters. We all know this UFC poster for UFC 246, McGregor versus Cerrone. We just talked about the fight in a little bit of detail, but the poster's weak. The faces don't match up. I mean, you got a really old picture of McGregor. You got an old picture of Cowboy. It's pretty weak, especially for a pay-per-view where typically they front load them or top load them with championship fights, and you get one without a championship. The pay-per-view in and of itself, I mean, if we look at it really quickly, I mean, let's go through it from bottom to top. Sabina Mazo, JJ Aldrich at 125, Odios Osborne taking on Brian Kelleher, Tim Elliott, Askarov, Kamor, and Ledet. You get Chaz Skelly, Grant Dawson, Hack Paras, Dober, Feely, Yusuf, Barber, Modafferi in your feature prelim. Then you have Anthony Pettis and Carlos Diego Fejea, Claudia Gadelia, Alexa Grasso, Alexia Linick, Maurice Green, Holly Holm, Raquel Pennington is your co-main event. And, of course, at the top, you have Cowboy and Conor McGregor. Is it a weak pay-per-view? It's probably a weak pay-per-view. Is it a weak poster? It's a very weak poster, in my opinion. Now, in the last 24 hours, we've seen the poster come out for UFC 247. Looks pretty cool. You've got John Jones and Reyes. You have Chukagian and Shevchenko. side by side or side by each, whatever. And it's a pretty decent poster, but I want to give credit where credit's due. Danilo de Almeida out there on Twitter. You can find him at 22 Danilo Almeida, at Needing Art, and I'm sure you've seen Needing Art out there over on Twitter, as well as Boss Logic. I mean, Boss Logic does great work with those posters. What should the UFC do with these posters? Really? I mean, we've seen them from Bellator and Ryzen in the last, couple of weeks. Those posters looked absolutely amazing. Even PFL Championships, which we'll get into, their poster looked great. So UFC kind of cheaps out sometimes. I mean, I know some of the old ones, like you look at it, Robbie Lawler, Johnny Hendricks. That was an awesome poster, comic book art. I have one here. Gustafson and Daniel Cormier. Gustafson's so tall, Daniel Cormier's so short. It looks kind of neat. But man, some of those posters aren't great. And even going back to what you used to have in the UFC, like way back when they were numbered events, but there was also, like UFC Death Punch or the like, you could kind of get a decent poster out of it. But lately they kind of lag behind. They're just kind of putting out some products that aren't that great. And it would be interesting to see where they go from here. So UFC Posters, I'd like to get your opinions. There's a lot of people out there doing some great graphic art, and you got to give the credit where it is due. Then we move on to the PFL Championships. And listen, we covered this extensively on the Loudmouth MMA Podcast Network this week. I see SM Cornerman a minute ago saying Carlos Diego Ferreira. You can find us on Early Stoppage. Maybe we have a change in night when that comes out. No. But you can find us there. You can also find me on Between the Links every Monday night with the Loudmouth MMA Podcast Network. But the point is, we talked about the PFL Championships extensively on this week's episode. And there's a lot of different, nuts to crack as far as this is concerned. The weird thing for me is that they signed Brendan Loughnane. It was a big deal. UFC passed on him. He ended up with PFL. And he fought in the prelims, and it wasn't televised. So it's interesting there. For a number of different reasons. The fact that they didn't televise it, what does it mean to you? I mean, I know the championship format's already set in stone. You have 6 fights. They're for belts. There's $1 million on the line in each. But you've got, a small theater at Madison Square Garden as your venue. Why wouldn't you just kind of capitalize and focus and say, hey, Brendan Loughnane, he's going to be a big deal in the next season, and we're really going to put all of our chips in on him. And we're going to give him a bit of a promotional push. Kind of similar to what they did with Kayla Harrison in the first season. But I know Loughnane came in late, didn't get a chance to compete in the whole season. They didn't get the marketing and whatnot behind him. But still, it's kind of weird that they didn't put a bigger focus on him. But going up through the list, I mean, you look at some of the winners. You had Emiliano Sordi, who competed in the first season, beating Jordan Johnson from the UFC. He decided not to sign with the UFC and came over to PFL undefeated, loses in the finals, and finishes with a record of 12-2 with 1 draw. He didn't have a great showing this year, which was kind of interesting. You had Lance Palmer fighting Alex Gilpin for the 3rd time in 2019 and beating him for the 3rd time. Everybody loves a rubber match like that. Palmer becoming a champion from 2018 holdover into 2019. Same thing as Natan Schultz getting the win over Loic Rajabov, who was from Tajikistan. Good to see the representation there. You had Ali Isaev getting the win over Jared Rosholt, UFC vet. Ray Cooper III beating David Michaud, which is a lot of people's can't miss type of fight that night. And then you also had in the finals Kayla Harrison versus Larissa Pacheco. Again, UFC vet there as well. She had a rough go in the UFC and fought some really tough competition in 2 fights. And she was only 21 years old. But I'd scored the fight 50-42 for Kayla Harrison, which was kind of crazy. One of the judges had it 50-43. The other 2 had it 50-45. And I've been feeding a fed horse, so to speak, with PFL Championships. But it's weird because it was a big deal the night that it was on. A lot of people were ragging on it on Twitter and on social media saying, it was kind of boring. They weren't interested in some of the fights, which I get because you look at the fight styles of some of the fighters there, like a Lance Palmer and Natan Schultz. I mean, yeah, the Schultz Rajabov fight was great, but Palmer maybe not trying to finish the fight. Same thing with Kayla Harrison. I mean, you know what they're doing. They're there to get a job done. They're fighting to their style. It'll be interesting to see how the 3rd season goes. If we see more of a push on it, of course, it's been on ESPN, and I know in the States, they're really, really trying to get a push on. But I don't know how long this type of format's going to last if they don't get a huge push. They don't start expanding some of those venues and really getting out there. So PFL Championships, like to get your opinion on that. And now it's time for your fight night picks. I'm going to go through some of mine, but I want to hear from yours. What are some of the things that you saw out there in the MMA space from this week that you wanted to cover? And Oliver Sell over on YouTube says, according to Tapology, UFC 246 is expected to double the best-selling pay-per-view from last year, which is UFC 235, and it did 650,000 buys, which is the last pay-per-view before ESPN+. Interesting stuff there. I wonder if it even gets into the top 20, and I'm talking about UFC 246. I wonder if this gets into the top 20 UFC pay-per-views of all time. In the States, they're kind of changing up the model just a little bit, and they tweaked it. Connor's been a part of, the top 4 or 5, if I'm not mistaken, or 5 of 5 UFC pay-per-views, if you look them up over on Tapology. It'll be interesting to see how this one sells, if you get the data, if you get the numbers. But yeah, I mean, always attracts eyes, and it's for sure going to be a big deal. Don't get me wrong. It's just going to be interesting to see how it all plays out in the grand scheme of things. If this even ends up as a top 20, a top 15, a top 10 UFC pay-per-view of all time, being in UFC 246. So I'd like to get your thoughts there. Some of the things that I picked up over this week, I said that UFC 246 is a little bit of a lighter card. With Fight Night Picks, what we're getting into with these pay-per-views, we're going to start doing your prelims, your main card, and your main event. There's no titles on the line. And for our last pay-per-view for 245, we get into it a little bit differently. There were 3 title fights, so for the first of 3, the co-main and the main event, we did 5-minute videos. We're going to do that for the main event here with McGregor and Cerrone, but for the rest, they're going to be 2 minutes. But if you'd like, and it's been something that we've got some feedback on, we're going to do the entire card, and we're going to profile it in detail. So look out for that one with Fight Night Picks over on YouTube. But if we continue along, kind of a weaker week in terms of MMA news. Some fights announced. Nick Lentz going to be taking on Nad Narimani, UFC Raleigh. A couple others peppered in there. But apart from that, the one thing, Sean Brady taking on Ismail Nardiev, UFC Norfolk. Damian Maia taking on Gilbert Burns. That's a really fun one. Gilbert Burns, I said when he was at 155, he's one of those guys that he has so many different skill sets and he's so good at different things. But if he could piece, they're kind of not pieced together. Now they are. And look at Gilbert Burns at 170 pounds. He's looked great so far. And I'm really looking forward to that fight because Damian Maia is one of those guys that in my mind's eye, he's definitely a measuring stick, but an upper end measuring stick. Not like a Vitor Belfort closer to the end of his UFC reign. Damian can still get it done, especially in his last fight. You saw that against Ben Askren. But that should be a good fight and a good test for Gilbert Burns. And the other thing that I wanted to talk about was, Mahmoud Muradov is one of those guys at 185 that you have to watch. And I'm really high on a couple of different fighters at 185. Rodolfo Vieira is one of those ones. If he was active in the UFC, and we get to see him quite a bit more, we've only seen him once. But if he could get on a roll, he's undefeated. He's an ADCC guy, IBJJF guy. He's great. He hits hard, but at the same time, his jiu-jitsu is just on that next level. So he's able to get it done in so many different ways. But another one of those fighters that I could see being a mover and shaker at 185 pounds is Mahmoud Muradov. And the big deal about him was the fact that he was the only MMA fighter that was linked, really heavily with Floyd Mayweather and the Money Team. And you look at what he's been able to do. He's only 29 years old. He's going to turn 30 in February. Fighting out of the Czech Republic, but he's from Uzbekistan. And since he's joined the UFC, wins over Alessio Di Chirico by decision, where he did look great, and then he knocked out Trevor Smith back in December. Well, now he's going to be taking on Shoeface Antonio Carlos Jr., who's, again, to me, he won the season of The Ultimate Fighter at heavyweight, but he's one of those litmus test type of guys at 185 pounds. And I think if Muradov gets a win there, it'll be very interesting to see how he makes out against that top 15 style competition. Oliver Sell over on YouTube says, what are your predictions for Mahmoud Muradov versus Carlos Jr.? I like this fight from Mahmoud. I think his wrestling is enough to keep Shoeface away from him, and he's fast for the weight class. He is very fast for the weight class. He's a heavy hitter, and we've seen from Antonio Carlos Jr. that sometimes cardio can be an issue. You're talking, age-wise. These guys are only separated by about a month in age. And you look at the last 2 fights. Let's look quickly at Shoeface since he's been in the UFC. So he comes in, he fights Vitor Miranda at heavyweight, gets the win there. Then he fights Pat Cummins at 205 and loses. And, you know, he moves down to 185. So his first fight at 185, you look at it, he takes on Eddie Gordon, gets a win, no contest, Kevin Casey, loses to Daniel Kelly, gets knocked out, and then he goes on a run and wins 5 in a row. Leonardo Guimaraes, he beats Marvin Vettori, beats Eric Spicely, beats Jack Marshman, beats Tim Boetsch, and then he takes on Ian Heinisch and loses. And peppered in there, he's supposed to take on Derek Brunson, Elias Theodore twice. They were canceled. Takes on Ian Heinisch, loses split to Uriah Hall. I think Mahmoud Muradov at this point in his career has, you know, a higher ceiling than a guy like Uriah Hall. And I love Uriah Hall. Like, don't get me wrong. Love watching a Uriah Hall performance because you always have to worry. He can pepper something in there strange. He can turn on a dime. He's explosive. I think Uriah Hall still, I view him as one of the better fighters at 185 pounds. Yeah, I know he beat Gegard Mousasi that one time, and then Mousasi avenged lost. But still, point being, I think I agree. I think Muradov is going to be able to get the win there. You always have to be worried when you get a striker taking on a guy like Carlos Jr. and you look at the wins that he's been able to have, especially the Tim Boetsch one. But again, Tim Boetsch later on in his career when he took on Carlos Jr., and I think Muradov, like you said, has a speed advantage. He'll be able to move in and out quite well. And if you miss that fight against Trevor Smith, maybe go back and have a look at it because that was a crazy, crazy win for Muradov in just the second UFC fight. So I think he's really been impressing a lot of people, myself included. And I think I really do think he has a good shot here in the UFC's 185-pound division. So with that, that is your Fight Night picks. We talked about some decent fights there, some of the different things going on in the sport. Fedor versus Lesnar. What could have happened? That was kind of the news during this week. Jason Hart says, love Carl's Jr. I love Carl's Jr. as well. And Jason, good point, you bringing that up. We do not have Carl's Jr. on the east coast of Canada. I wish we did. They have them on the west coast. I know in Saskatchewan, Alberta they do. I absolutely love Carl's Jr. I think it's a better option than Burger King. It's very similar to Burger King. I'm a burger guy. I like Carl's Jr. I like that comment. Thank you. Be sure to follow along at Jason the Heart and MMA on Point on YouTube. It's a good point of mentioning that. And I mean, with that, this week's episode of Question Mark Kicks. If you want to hit me up on Twitter and Instagram at Craig Allen FNP, you can find me there. The other half of our co-hosting duo with our predictions, Matt Allen FNP, and Matt Allen recently joining the team over at the Loudmouth MMA Podcast Network. So look out for Matt to be popping off and you know, making his way in the world of podcasting. I'm looking forward to it. I think he has a really high ceiling, or, you know, not just the fact that he's my brother, but I think he does actually do some really great work. So you're going to want to follow along with him. And coming up down the pipe for this week, between the links on Monday night with Loudmouth, you can find me there. I think we have a really great guest lined up for this week. You can also find articles over at fightnightpicks.net. I kind of teased it a little bit, but I'm pretty sure what we're going to do this week is that we're going to have our predictions for UFC 246. We're going to put them out a little bit early. Like I said, we're going to have prelims and main card, so you're not going to want to miss that. And just a lot of stuff going on with Fight Night Picks. So if you want to find us, like I said, Twitter and Instagram, at Craig Allen FNP, at Matt Allen FNP. And we will see you again next week with another episode of Fight Night Picks, Question Mark Kicks.
It's time
For 15 minutes of non-stop MMA, tackling the biggest news in the sport. Head into the chat and let us know how you feel. Live from Fredericton, New Brunswick, Canada. Here's your host, Craig Allen.